The teachings of Jesus on love and compassion. 1. The greatest commandment: love God and love your neighbor. One of the most profound and central teachings of Jesus is his articulation of the greatest commandment, which is found in Matthew 22, verses 37 to 39. When Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment in the law, he answered unequivocally, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This was the first and greatest commandment. He continued, but then, without hesitation, he added, "The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Here, Jesus perfectly encapsulates the whole of God's will for humanity, two great loves: love for God and love for others. In this teaching, Jesus establishes a direct link between our love for God and our love for others. Love for God is not merely a feeling or an abstract concept. It is demonstrated through the way we treat others. The truth is that one cannot claim to love God without loving people, especially those in need. This commandment stands as a radical reorientation of human relationships, moving love away from selfishness and towards selflessness. The early Christian church, from its inception, took these two commandments seriously, and many of its key figures exemplified these teachings in their lives. For example, Saint Francis of Assisi lived out the command to love God by choosing to live a life of poverty, humility, and service to others. He famously said, "Preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary." For Saint Francis, serving others, especially the poor and marginalized, was the clearest demonstration of his love for God. His commitment to living out the love of God through compassion for others is an enduring model of how Jesus' teachings can shape the life of a believer. However, loving one's neighbor is not always easy, especially when those neighbors are difficult or even hostile. This is why Jesus' second commandment is so radical. It calls for a love that goes beyond friendship and extends even to those who may not reciprocate it. In modern society, the challenge of loving others as Jesus taught has never been more relevant. As our world becomes increasingly divided along racial, social, and political lines, Jesus' command to love neighbors, whether they share our beliefs or not, remains a call to bridge divides. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the greatest proponents of love in the 20th century, embodied this command in his life and work. King famously stated, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." He understood that love was not about sentimentality, but about active engagement, even in the face of hatred. 2. Love your enemies, a radical call for reconciliation. Perhaps one of the most radical and countercultural teachings of Jesus is found in his command to love one's enemies. In Matthew 5 verses 43 to 44, Jesus teaches, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." This is an invitation to embrace a love that goes beyond human instinct. It is an invitation to reconciliation, even when wronged, and to forgiveness, even when hurt. This teaching is profoundly radical because it challenges human nature. Human instinct often calls for retaliation when we are wronged. Revenge and justice are deeply embedded in our social systems. But Jesus calls us to break the cycle of violence and vengeance. His command to love our enemies speaks directly to the need for reconciliation and healing in the midst of conflict. Consider the example of Nelson Mandela. After spending 27 years in prison under the apartheid regime in South Africa, Mandela chose not to pursue revenge against his captors upon his release. Instead, he sought reconciliation. He led the country toward peace and unity, advocating for forgiveness over retaliation. Mandela's example was a modern-day embodiment of Jesus' teaching to love one's enemies. He saw that only by choosing love over hate could South Africa hope to heal the wounds of its past. But the call to love our enemies is not merely about national or political reconciliation. It's about personal reconciliation as well. Think of Pope John Paul II, who, after being shot by a would-be assassin in 1981, forgave the man who tried to kill him. He met with the shooter and extended his forgiveness. Pope John Paul II's act of compassion and love in this deeply personal, Violent context demonstrated the transformative power of Jesus' teachings. It wasn't a passive forgiveness, it was an active, deliberate choice to embrace love over hatred, a model that Christians are called to follow in all aspects of life. Today, in a world torn by divisions of race, religion, and ideology, Jesus' call to love our enemies is more necessary than ever. It invites us to set aside our prejudices and, instead, build bridges of peace and understanding, whether it's in our personal relationships, our communities, or our nations. The transformative power of loving our enemies is the key to breaking down walls and healing wounds. 3. The parable of the Good Samaritan, compassion in action. The parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10 verses 25 to 37, is one of the clearest illustrations of what Jesus' compassion looks like in action. In this parable, a man is beaten, robbed, and left for dead on the side of the road. Two respected members of society, a priest and a Levite, pass by without offering assistance, but a Samaritan, a man from a group despised by the Jews, stops, helps the wounded man, and ensures he receives care, even at his own expense. The significance of this story cannot be overstated. Jesus' audience would have found it shocking. The Samaritan was the least likely person to show compassion in their eyes, and yet it is he who demonstrates true mercy. Through this parable, Jesus makes it clear that compassion is not limited by race, religion, or social status. True compassion transcends boundaries and is available to all. This teaching is not just theoretical. It challenges us to go beyond surface-level charity and seek to make a real difference in the lives of others. The Good Samaritan's compassion wasn't a fleeting feeling. It was a deliberate decision to act and to help someone in need. Even at personal cost, Jesus calls us to embrace vulnerability, to stop and help those who may seem different from us, even when it requires effort and sacrifice. In our modern world, there are countless Good Samaritans who continue to serve others selflessly. Take, for instance, Dr. Paul Farmer, a physician and anthropologist who co-founded Partners in Health, a nonprofit that provides health care to the impoverished around the world. Dr. Farmer's work exemplifies the kind of compassion Jesus demonstrated in the parable. He didn't just provide medical treatment. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the most vulnerable had access to health care regardless of their status, nationality, or background. 4. The Prodigal Son, God's compassion and unconditional love. The parable of the prodigal son, Luke 15 verses 11 to 32, stands as one of the most beautiful expressions of God's unconditional love. In this story, a younger son asks for his inheritance early and spends it recklessly. When he finds himself destitute, he returns to his father, expecting rejection. Instead, his father runs to him, embraces him, and restores him to his place in the family. The father's actions in this parable are a powerful picture of God's grace and unfathomable love. Even though the son squandered his inheritance, the father's love was not contingent on the son's actions or worthiness. God's love is not based on merit, but is a love that seeks the lost and welcomes them home. Jesus uses this parable to demonstrate the boundless mercy of God, a mercy that seeks to restore and heal, no matter how far one has fallen. This parable resonates deeply with many individuals who have experienced grace and forgiveness. Take, for example, John Newton, the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. Newton was once a slave trader, involved in the exploitation and mistreatment of others. Yet, after a profound conversion experience, he became an ardent abolitionist and a champion for human dignity. His own life was a reflection of the prodigal son's return, where God's grace transformed him from a man of sin to a man of mercy. 5. Compassion as active service, Jesus as a healer. Throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus demonstrated compassion not just through words but through actions. His healing miracles were powerful signs, but they were also a deep expression of God's love and mercy for a broken world. Matthew 14 verse 14 recounts, "When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick." The compassion that moved Jesus was not merely a passive feeling, but an active, sacrificial love that sought to restore individuals physically, emotionally, And spiritually, he didn't just heal the sick to prove his divinity. He healed them because he was moved by their suffering. One of the most striking aspects of Jesus' healing ministry is that he did not discriminate. He healed lepers, a group considered untouchable in Jewish society. As seen in Luke 17 verses 11 to 19, the leper, desperate for healing, fell at Jesus' feet and begged for mercy. Jesus did not hesitate. He touched the man, something that would have been considered ceremonially unclean. But for Jesus, the physical act of touching the leper was a sign of his deep compassion and willingness to break societal barriers. Mother Teresa, who dedicated her life to caring for the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, mirrored this aspect of Jesus' compassion. She famously said, "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." Her life was a testimony to Jesus' command to serve others without hesitation or judgment. She, too, served the outcasts, those whom society often overlooked or despised. By caring for the sick and dying in the streets of Calcutta, Mother Teresa exemplified the healing compassion that Jesus called his followers to embody. In our modern world, acts of healing and service are still deeply needed. The work of organizations like Doctors Without Borders or individuals who serve in war zones, disaster areas, and refugee camps shows that the call to compassion is not just a theological idea but a practical and urgent need. Christians today are still called to go and do likewise, Luke 10 verse 37, to be active participants in the healing of our world. Whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, true compassion requires action, not just empathy. 6. The compassionate forgiver, the crucifixion and Jesus' ultimate act of love. The ultimate demonstration of Jesus' compassion and love is found not in his miracles, but in his sacrifice on the cross. In the final hours of his life, as he hung in excruciating pain, Jesus spoke words that still echo through history. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23 verse 34. These words are not only an example of forgiveness, they are a call to all Christians to forgive, even in the face of immense pain and injustice. The crucifixion itself is the culmination of Jesus' teaching on compassion and love. The people who condemned him, the soldiers who crucified him, and even those who mocked him, none of these deserved his forgiveness. Yet Jesus forgave them all, demonstrating that true love and compassion are not based on what people deserve, but on what God has chosen to give. This is the radical nature of divine love. It is unconditional, it is sacrificial, and it is offered even to those who are hostile and unrepentant. One of the most moving examples of a person living out this radical forgiveness is Immaculée Ilibagiza, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. During the genocide, she and several other women hid in a small bathroom for 91 days to escape the violent attacks. Immaculée lost most of her family members during this period. After the genocide, rather than being consumed by hatred, she chose to forgive the people responsible for her suffering. In her book Left to Tell, she writes about how she forgave the men who murdered her family and how she found peace through that forgiveness. Her story is a testimony to the transforming power of Jesus' forgiveness and compassion. Like Jesus, Immaculée chose to forgive, even though she had been deeply wronged, and her example has inspired countless people around the world to seek peace in the midst of profound hurt. Jesus' words on the cross and his forgiveness of his enemies invite us to re-examine our own attitudes toward forgiveness. How often do we withhold forgiveness from those who have wronged us, even when the offense seems trivial in comparison? Jesus' model of forgiveness is not only a theological point but a practical one: to forgive as he forgave, to love as he loved, and to extend mercy even to those who may never ask for it. 7. The call to imitate Christ's compassion in our lives. Jesus' teachings on love and compassion were not meant to be abstract ideas or idealized values to admire from a distance. They were meant to be lived out in the lives of his followers. In Ephesians 5 verses 1 to 2, the Apostle Paul urges believers to be imitators of God and to live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. To imitate Christ is to embody his compassion in our daily lives, through our actions, our words, and our choices. Jesus not only taught about love, he showed love in everything he did. His love was practical, not theoretical. Whether it was reaching out to the Samaritan woman at the well, John 4, feeding the 5,000 with a small boy's lunch, John 6, or washing his disciples' feet, John 13. Jesus' compassion was tangible. He did not wait for others to ask for help. He took the initiative to meet people where they were and provide for their needs. This call to imitate Christ's compassion requires that we make his values a part of our daily lives. It is not enough to love only when it is convenient or when we are surrounded by people who think like us. Jesus' love is unconditional and self-sacrificial, and so should ours be. The life of a true disciple of Christ involves a willingness to serve others, even when it requires personal sacrifice. One modern example of someone imitating Christ's compassion is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who resisted the Nazi regime. Bonhoeffer's life was marked by his willingness to speak out against injustice, even at great personal cost. He famously said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless." Bonhoeffer's life demonstrated that following Jesus' example of compassion often requires standing against the forces of oppression and injustice, even when it comes at the cost of one's own safety or comfort. His commitment to living out Christ's love and compassion ultimately led to his martyrdom, but his legacy continues to inspire Christians to this day. In addition, countless other individuals and organizations today continue to embody this kind of love and service. Doctors Without Borders, Habitat for Humanity, and the Salvation Army are just a few examples of Christian organizations dedicated to serving others in Christ's name. Each of these organizations embodies the call to live out compassion through practical service, whether by providing medical care in crisis zones, building homes for the homeless, or offering food and shelter to the marginalized. Conclusion: the radical love and compassion of Jesus. Jesus' teachings on love and compassion were not just revolutionary in his time, they continue to be revolutionary today. His radical love, shown in his willingness to love even his enemies, his unconditional forgiveness, and his sacrificial service are timeless principles that challenge us to rethink how we live our lives. They call us to a higher standard of love, a love that is unconditional, self-sacrificial, and active in service to others. As we look to the examples of modern figures like Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Immaculée Ilibagiza, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we see that the teachings of Jesus are not mere ideals, but living principles that have been embodied throughout history. These individuals, in their own unique ways, have followed Jesus' example of selfless love and radical compassion, inspiring millions to do the same. The challenge today is for each of us to take up this call to live out Christ's compassion in our own contexts, whether in our homes, our communities, or our workplaces. Jesus' message is clear: love your neighbor, forgive your enemies, serve the suffering, and always, always, be willing to sacrifice for the good of others. In doing so, we participate in God's work of healing and reconciliation in a broken world.